It's my pleasure and really honor to welcome you to this fall's lecture on inequality, discrimination, and opportunity, which we abbreviate as LIDO or LIDO. And this event is actually co-sponsored by the Economics Department, along with the Rockefeller Center, the Sadie Alexander Association, and the Schoolhouse Anti-Racism Experience. And we'd like to extend a special welcome to the students who are in the Principles of Economics classes. Those of you who are just beginning your study of economics, this is a really exciting evening that we have together here. The purpose of the LEO lecture, it really started from the Economics Department's statement on racial justice that we agreed to in June of 2020. And that led to a number of things, including the launch of this series, which is aimed at deepening our understanding of the role of inequality, discrimination, and opportunity in society, and how the field of economics can inform public policy responses to those challenges. So this will be the fourth LEDO lecture. The first one was in spring of 2021. Professor Rucker Johnson from UC Berkeley talked about his research on school integration. And then a year ago, last fall, Professor Nina Banks from Bucknell University talked about her research on Sadie Alexander, who was the first Black female to earn a PhD in economics. And then last spring, we had Professor Trevon Logan from Ohio State University, who gave a lecture about Jim Crow segregation and the civil rights movement. So I'm actually not going to introduce our distinguished speaker. I'm going to turn the microphone over to John, and John is going to give that introduction. And by the way, John is also going to moderate the Q&A, so you can give him a hint if you want to ask a question after the lecture.
Thank you, Professor Levin, and good evening, everyone. My name is John Ejiogo, and I'm a senior major in economics here at Dartmouth. Within the department, I'm part of the Sadie Alexander Association, SAA for short. And our mission at SAA is to demystify the study of economics for underrepresented minorities and provide a strong support system for intellectual excellence in the field. And we are very honored to welcome very distinguished Professor William Spriggs to Dartmouth College today. Professor Spriggs teaches at the Department of Economics at Howard University, a department which he in the past chaired. He currently serves as the Chief Economist to the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, where he chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. In addition, he serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research, as well as on the advisory board to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. Throughout his over 40-year career thus far, Professor Spriggs has arguably made indelible and remarkable marks in the U.S. national, state, and local policy in a variety of respects: labor, health, race, economic development, education, to mention but a few. And he has rightfully been the recipient of many coveted awards, including the National Academy of Social Insurance's Robert M. Ball Award for outstanding achievements in social insurance. In terms of education, Professor Spriggs holds a cum laude bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Williams College, as well as master's and doctorate degrees in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So please join me in giving a very well-deserved and warm welcome to an academic scholar and a professional juggernaut, Professor William Spriggs. We are very honored to have you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being on time. I don't think I've ever seen a class filled up on time, ever. So I take that as a huge honor. And thank you for this invitation to speak to you. I have too many slides for my lecture. I'm going to race through them the best I can, and then I'm going to end up being forced to stop so that I can take questions. Please let me race through them. I will get to your questions. And unless I have something that's really confusing and you're like, what? And I will share them because people in the department already have them. So if you want to know what the rest of them were, hopefully I get so far that they'll be self-explanatory. So I'm going to talk about why I think economists model race and discrimination incorrectly. I'm going to give you a concept of race that you may or may not be familiar with, but it is for the purposes of economics and the use of race in economics. Please do not make comments to me about, are you saying there's no such thing as black people, there's no such thing as black culture, blah, 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 because actually as an undergrad, I was also into theater. That wasn't listed on my biography. I studied under Larry Neal. Those of you who are English majors will understand the importance of Larry Neal and his book, Black Fire, that he did with Leroy Jones on the Black Arts Movement. So please don't go there. I do believe there is such a thing as black culture, et cetera. But this is race as used by economists in studying how do we understand what economists study. Who gets what, how much do they get, when do they get it, why do they get it, and how do they get it? So I'm a labor economist by training, and most economists are very familiar with this rather permanent gap in earnings between black and white men. So this top line here is all men. This is unadjusted for education, and that's black men unadjusted for education. The light blue line is if you include factors like education, experience, region, because people in the South get paid less, metro status, people in cities tend to get paid more. If you control for all of that, then you see that for black men, since 1980, it's a pretty flat curve around 22%. If you do black women, if you control for everything, you get this kind of permanent gap of close to 12%, it's 11.7%. So even if you control for education, which is the knee-jerk reaction of economists, this is the gap you get. We're familiar with these kind of permanents to this. And the way that we try to do economics is normally to explain those gaps. And what you see in the light blue line, what you see in what is the red line, but not the crimson line, but the red line at the bottom, that's the typical, this is where the road ends. You can add some more variables. It doesn't change the answer very much. And so then the debate ensues. This is the way economists normally do this. It's more permanent. The gap is even more permanent, and without attempting to control for differences in education, but looking at the difference between black and white male earnings at different points in the income distribution. So if we look at very high earners, those in the top, so in the top 90th percentile, that very high bar there, that's the earnings of white men. And the 90th percentile, the very 10% highest earners. The bar below that, that's black men. You will see that the gap stays fairly flat, and then it expands a little bit when we get to this century. And then the lines that are the blue dashed lines, the ones with the white triangles, that's white men at the median, half above, half below in earnings. And then for black men, it's the black dot. That's median earnings. You see it stays somewhat stable, and then earnings at the median start to fall in this century for all men, but the gap between black and white men stays kind of constant. So normally what economists do is they try to look at these differences and decompose them as if these two groups are an experiment, as if I ran an experiment and made some of them black and some of them white. That's the only difference in the experiment. And under a set of assumptions about how the market works. Let me talk about why I think economists do this all wrong. So what did economists do when they originally had to confront issues of disparity? And we're going to look at the actual words, direct quotes, of Economist. I'm going to, again, leave the slides. I encourage you to read these 4 pieces because they go back to look at the history of the founding of the American Economic Association and the latter part of the 19th century. The founding members, to a man and woman, and even those who weren't exactly modelers of economics in the way that many of you are taught it, had a singular view about how to think about race. So I encourage you to read one of those articles. Again, I'm going to leave the slides, so don't worry if you missed them in taking notes. But let's look at what they said, the founding AEA members, their words. Oops. This is Edward Ross. Edward Ross coined the phrase, you will see there, whoops. So Edward Ross coined this phrase, race suicide. Now, some of these terms that you're going to see are actually contemporary because some of you have seen these words more recently. If you think about the attack on Charlottesville, you will remember them chanting, Jews will not replace us, right? This is the language of race suicide. The thought that the superior Aryan race was about to be displaced by inferior races. This actually was phrased by Ross. The higher race quietly and unmurmuringly eliminates itself rather than endure individually the bitter competition it has failed to ward off by collective action. Now, Ross is famous because he was the test case for academic freedom, for freedom of speech. When he was making that statement, he was referring to Chinese immigrants, Chinese workers who had been brought in to work on the Pacific Railroad. Unfortunately for him, it happened to be a railroad owned by Leland Stanford, who did not like him making these disparaging remarks and tried to dismiss him from Stanford's faculty. And then, so, I mean, freedom of academic speech, the right wing always wants to say, oh, this is because you over-liberal people, blah, 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 blah. But actually, the original defense of this was over somebody making an obnoxious, racist statement who said that I'm free to say this about Chinese. This one is more telling here about his attitude, right? The theory that races are virtually equal in capacity leads to such monumental follies as lining the valleys of the South with the bones of 500,000 picked whites in order to improve conditions of 4 million unpicked blacks. This is his characterization in 1907 when Civil War heroes were still alive, the men who actually braved their lives to save our country. This was his characterization that they died in vain. This was stupid to waste white men in order to free black people. You are taking the picked, the most desirable, and you're wasting their blood for nothing. This was a stupid war, and you shouldn't have had it. Francis Walker from MIT, who was the first president of the AEA, also believed in race suicide. This will sound familiar. A certain president said this in different words about countries. He said, peasants from southern Italy, Hungary, Austria, and Russia are beaten men from beaten races, representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. Centuries are against them, as centuries were on the side of those who formerly came to us. Sounds like somebody who's complaining about immigrants who come from horrible countries. And why can't we get the people from the good countries? It's sort of the same thing. And he repeats this again about this idea of competing with inferior races. Now, I bring this up because you will notice their use of the term race. Italians, Hungarians, Russians, in which case he really means Jews, right? He's using those as race. Those are not the modern way that some of you may think about it, but think about it from their time period. So look at that carefully because, again, the way we throw around race is very cavalier, but look at how they're using it because they're using it in a way that's different than we do today, but maybe informative as you think about how we try and model it because they certainly would think, as the census did, that these were different races if you look at the early census records. Even my hero, John R. Commons, an institutionalist, not one of these bracky model people, but John R. Commons, an institutionalist who I thought was the hero of the working man, this is what John R. Commons said about black workers. They are indolent and fickle. The Negro could not possibly have found a place in American industry had he come as a free man. If such races are to adopt that industrious life, which is second nature to races of the temperate zones, it is only through some form of compulsion, slavery. And I thought, that's just the men. This is just, a macho thing. But then my heart broke when Emily Balch, who helped to establish economics at Wellesley, in proposing progressive ideas. These economists were considered the giants of progressive politics of the time because they pushed for what appeared to be a more democratic America. They believed in public education. They believed in a reasonable workday. For perverse reasons, they believed in the minimum wage. So this was a question put to her about, well, you want public school, but these are children who are immigrants from poor places. Shouldn't we have lunch at school? And her answer is, if you simply want to have more people, depraved people, quite as well as any other class, then feeding school children is a good thing. But if you believe it is important to have more of the right kind of people, then any measure of encouragement should be most carefully selective in character. If you feed these Italian immigrants and these Jews in New York, you're going to get more of them. This is not good. You should only feed the right kind of people. These are the people who founded the discipline. The problem here is they are clearly showing a view that race is exogenous. It is something that we observe, and then we get to be free to comment on, and we can ascribe characteristics to these races because they're given to us like you would describe anything else that's exogenous. It is peculiar and weird, even kind of odd in this time period that that's what they're doing. Now, they put this in textbooks. So it's not just that they thought it, but if you were trained as an economist in the early part of the 20th century, this is how you were told to think about it. That the vitality of capital is impaired by a breeding of the worst and a cessation of the breeding of the best. Or you would have read in your textbook that democracy and opportunity are increasing the mediocre and reducing the excellent strains of stock. So as an economist, this is what you were taught to think, which means you then teach another generation that in essence inequality is good, that you really should not want equality, and you're fighting against nature, and that these races shouldn't be encouraged. Now, all of those thoughts came from the American eugenics movement. Fortunately, in the United States, because of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, Americans came to be abhorrent of the ideas of the eugenics movement, and it did its best to shrivel up, thank goodness, but its remnants remained. So if you thought, but those were thoughts then, but they don't stick to it. I encourage you to read this article from Greg Price, and we call him Sandy, William Darity. Because in the state of North Carolina, through the 1960s, they still practiced eugenics on black women, forcing sterilization under the guise of these logics that you don't want more inferior people. So it's not that we dropped it forever in the United States. But the legacy of thinking race is exogenous still remains as the way that economists think about things. Regrettably, part of that is a built-in bias also, that there is some sort of inherent inequality that we should expect. Now, economists have tried to walk away from that, but it still creeps into our thoughts. So again, why are they saying this at that time period? Who knows who this is? Anybody? It's Plessy from Plessy versus Ferguson. Which is that? Is this Plessy the person who wanted to buy the ticket on the train car? Or is Plessy the guy who runs the railroad? Because we know that when they go to the Supreme Court, the plaintiff and the defendant get switched depending upon who won or lost on appeal. So is this the guy buying the train ticket, or is this the railroad operator? Anybody want to guess?
I guess this is the railroad owner because he's white.
Okay. This looks like the railroad owner because he's white. How many people want to agree? That's it? That's all who agree? Okay. Well, this is Homer Plessy. He is, in fact, black, according to the state of Louisiana. Now, many people think about Plessy v. Ferguson, and they know it because this is the Supreme Court case we understand allowed states to say we can have separate facilities by race. That was the most lasting, lingering part of the decision that people retain. But let's see what Plessy himself argued. Plessy argued, I am 1/8 black. So you have two parents, that would make you a mulatto because a half. You have 4 grandparents, that would make you a quadroon if one of them. 8 means great-grandparent. So of his 8 great-grandparents, great-grandparents, not his grandparents. Some of you don't know your great-grandparent. Of his great-grandparents, 1 was black. He argued, therefore, since I am 7/8 white, I am white. And I bought a ticket to sit in the white section, and I should sit in the white section. The state of Louisiana said no. So actually what people are missing, the most important part of this is the Supreme Court said, you can be whatever you think you are in your head, but the state of Louisiana decides who's black and who's white. And in the state of Louisiana, you are black, Homer Adolph Plessy. And so you wanted to argue that you got to sit in the white section? No. On the standing, you have standing, you bought a ticket, but on the actual argument, no, the state of Louisiana decides race. It's defined. It's defined so we can say who can and who cannot. It's made up. They could have said, 7/8, that's a supermajority. So you're white. But they didn't. There's a reason they're drawing the line. There's a reason they're saying one group here and one group there. This is an endogenous decision. From an economist perspective, you are maximizing something here. And we, in society, this society gets to declare that. So when these economists are acting like it's exogenous, when the rubber meets the road, it's not really exogenous. Now, so you can see this, let's look at how things get decided. Now, anti-miscegenation laws existed before the 20th century. They got reinforced during the 20th century. Long other story, but just roll with me. But here you see they have to define race. Because if I'm going to say two people cannot marry, then I have to define who can't marry whom. You notice in Florida, it says Negro descent to the 4th generation. So not your great-grandparents, but your great-great-grandparents, your second great-grandparents. Nebraska says 1/8, sort of the Homer Plessy test, one great-grandparent. But then they also throw in whites can't either marry Japanese or Chinese people either. Maryland says 3rd generation, which is the same as saying 1/8. We went through the math. So Nebraska and Maryland agree on who's black. But Maryland then says, we don't want any intermixture. So not only are we going to talk about who white people can't marry, they also say black people can't marry people who are Malay. And you notice they're making up these race names. This is really a wild ride here, right? And then, so blacks can't marry Malays, Malays can't marry blacks, they can't marry whites. It's all quite confusing, but we must define this. This is all endogenous. Now, why 3 generations or 4 generations, you may ask? Well, think about it. We're in 1920 for most of these laws. So 3rd generation is an indirect way of saying your relative was a slave. If any of your relatives had been slaves, is an indirect sort of thing that they're getting at here, then you can't. Now, what's the purpose here again? We're declaring teams. So you have to put this together. It's not only are we declaring teams, but we have to enforce the team, right? You can't change jerseys. You got on that green jersey. When you play Harvard, do not put on a crimson jersey, right? That's what we're saying here. No changing jerseys. Has to be fixed. From an economist's perspective, this fixes the proportions. Because if you don't fix the proportions, then this can go out of hand. It's important, the anti-miscegenation laws, because they have to overcome being humans, right? The first thing that most men see when they see a woman is not necessarily her race. They're looking at a woman. And for many women, the first thing you see when you see a man, it's a man. This is secondary once you get through the whole list of things you like, don't like, whatever, but that's not like, oh, the first thing that popped in my mind, right? So if you don't keep the teams honest, then people are going to switch teams, they'll switch sides. We cannot have this. We must have a fixed number, then it works. Because I'm trying to keep a fixed number of people limited to certain places, and I need them to stay there. Now, they carry these laws to great extremes. I'm only giving you a few just so you can understand that we're trying to enforce a system. We're trying to create a set of rules that keep my coalitions fixed. In Mississippi, any person presenting for public acceptance or general information, arguments, or suggestions in favor of social equality or of intermarriage between whites and Negroes shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine not exceeding $500. Because this is law in Mississippi, all of this segregation, you cannot speak against it. You cannot undermine it. You cannot suggest to someone that this law has no legitimacy because you are preaching that, but the races are equal. You cannot do that. This is illegal. We will fine you. This one, because I do labor, this one is to show you the extent that they are going, because this is a labor regulation, that it shall be unlawful for any person, firm, or corporation engaged in the business of cotton textile manufacturing, this is South Carolina, in this state, this is so absurd, to allow or permit operatives, help, and labor of different races to labor and work together within the same room. We are going to outlaw that you would have a textile line in which you would have blacks and whites in the same room. They can't be at other ends of the loom. The black guy can't come in and sweep while the white workers are working on the loom. They can't be in the same room. Use the same doors of entrance, or to occupy the same pay ticket windows when they get paid. And this one is the one that you're going, wait, time out. What did you say? They are not allowed to use the same stairway and windows at the same time. Black workers and white workers cannot look out of the same window. So when you see economists say, well, we'll just throw race into the equation, but understand what race means in this context. You cannot hire these workers to look at the same window. They have to have separate windows. That's not just this is how much I want to make sure that I keep them in different occupations, in different strata. They can't mix in any way. And then these penalties have to have meaning. This is Maryland's continuation of its anti-miscegenation law. So to give it extra meaning, any white woman who shall suffer or permit herself to be got with child by a Negro or mulatto shall be sentenced to the penitentiary for not less than, now this is not a maximum, this is a minimum sentence, not less than 18 months. Economists just glide over the violence of this system. This system must be maintained. It has high cost for you violating the system. You can't switch teams, 18 months in jail for switching teams. This has to have a high cost. I must make the rules stick. And this is what economists do. And so it's taking race as exogenous and saying, it's just an experiment. Suppose I look at these workers who are not allowed to look out the same window, walk up the same staircase, go to the same window to get paid. Suppose I just do an experiment and say, one's black, where are they going to get paid? I just went through all of this to make sure I made them separate. Why are you asking the question then? Now, in the 1950s, economists evolved, thank goodness, and Gary Becker started studying the issue of race. He was moved very much by what happened to Emmett Till and the subsequent activities in the South by the Montgomery bus boycott led by Dr. King. So he decided he would try and model race. And in modeling race, he decided to use good economic tools, referring to individual taste and preferences. It could be the preference of an employer. It could be the preference of other workers. It could be the preferences of customers. But suppose customers individually didn't like a certain race. And then what would happen? Now, the nice rosy tale out of this that economists have taken as our mantra is, well, since race is this made-up thing, it has nothing to do with productivity, then over time, these people with these tastes to discriminate would become dinosaurs because in the long run, competition would weigh them out. Now, that's not fair to Gary Becker. People should read his book. But that's the way in which economists have interpreted it. And So the perception of economists is that in a free market, discrimination can't be real. The market wouldn't discriminate. It wouldn't be rational. That's the current operating mechanism. Again, taken out is the violence. It's sort of astounding to me that Becker did this in response to Emmett Till. Becker was at the University of Chicago. Emmett Till's funeral was in Chicago. This was well publicized. The young man on the left is Emmett Till as a very handsome young man. The thing on the right is what happened to Emmett Till when he was murdered. His mother wanted his casket open so that people could see what was done to her son, so they could understand the violence in this system, so they could understand that this young man could do something that could lead to him being beaten to that. In 1957, when the Economics of Discrimination was actually published, that was the same year of the Little Rock Nine. Arkansas refused to follow court orders to integrate their high school, and the governor refused to have his National Guard provide for the safety of the black students to attend the school. So President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard to provide safety for the Little Rock Nine to attend school. Unfortunately for Elizabeth Eckford, as you can see in this picture, she missed her pickup point. They had all agreed on where to meet. She didn't meet when she was supposed to. So she was left coming by herself. You will notice, if you've ever been somewhere with a real security detail, the security detail creates what is called a perimeter. So they create a huge buffer between who they're trying to protect and everybody else. And they're supposed to stay on the other side of the perimeter. You will notice where the National Guard are. They are not between this young teenager and the mob. They are behind the mob. They have let the perimeter be broken. And you see this group of people following her. This is, mind you, 2 years after what happened to Emmett Till. They're not saying, oh, would you please come to tea with us? To characterize this as, oh, it's just taste and preferences. It's just, some people like to sit over there, and other people like to sit over here. And we have our table, and you have your table. To model this as if it's some sort of sterile system that doesn't have this violence attached to it misses the point of how serious people were about making these divisions and making them stick. So I'm going to now walk through what I think we should do differently in modeling and the cues that I think economists miss when we do what we do. So this is a picture taken in Okmulgee, Oklahoma in 1908. For those of you who may be familiar with Oklahoma, it was originally Indian territory because after President Jackson kicked Native Americans out of the East, the quote-unquote civilized tribes, and marched them on the Trail of Tears, he took away their land and marched them across the United States to Oklahoma, part of which was Creek territory. The Creek Indians originally lived on the border of Georgia and Alabama. Whenever you see the word "gee," then you know that this is a place name among the Creek people. So you're familiar with Muskogee. This is Okmulgee. Others of you may be familiar with Tuskegee, which is Creek for the land of the warrior. So these people are in Okmulgee in 1908. The man in the center is Hilliard James. This picture was taken because it's the funeral for his wife, Matilda. All of the people in the back are his children, and they came to the funeral. I have a red circle around the man in the back, a green circle around the woman in the front for a reason, because the whole family in 1908 is in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, not because they were always there. They are not Creek Indians. These are African Americans. But the guy with the red circle is Isaac James. The woman in the green circle is Emma James Wade. They were not in Oklahoma. They had to come to the funeral from Alabama. The family was originally from Alabama. Right after slavery ended, they were in Barber County, Alabama. Barber County, Alabama was heavily populated by blacks, and because of the black majority, they kept electing a black person as a legislator, which of course did not please the white minority. And at the election of 1874, whites decided, we're taking over the county. And they laid a trap at the polling places. Blacks were aware that they were going to be intimidated. They decided that they would try and count on the Union Army, which still occupied Alabama at that time, but the Union Army was under some orders to stand down in local affairs, and the Union Army decided to stand down. The mob stormed where the ballots were being counted and kept. They killed the son of the judge who was in charge of the ballot box, stole the ballot box, and at the election lines, they had ambushed black voters, killing dozens of black voters who had lined up to vote. So from then on, Barber County, by force, became Democratic. Presto, who knew? All those other votes disappeared. That's where they lived. So, not surprisingly, that's where they moved from. They end up in Tuscumbia, Alabama, where in 1902, a man named Will Reynolds, who was black, decided he did not want to be arrested. He happened to be an excellent sharpshooter. And so Will Reynolds set up station, and when the sheriff came, he instantly killed the sheriff, one shot. The deputy sheriff came to the sheriff's aid, shot him, one shot. Then the townspeople came, and in the end, he had killed 9 people. The town was so enraged at the audacity of this man to be shooting all these people. This is still one of the biggest losses of public safety life in Alabama history. They decided to get to him, they would burn the houses around Will Reynolds' house. So they burned the 2 houses next to him to the ground in order to get him out so that they could lynch him. The 2 houses that they burned down: the house of Hilliard James and the house of his daughter, the woman in the far upper right-hand corner. That was in 1902. So in 1903, the family, following the woman on the far left, the woman on the far left is Hilliard James' oldest daughter, Henrietta. She had gone to Oklahoma at the end of the 19th century because Hilliard's sister did marry a Creek Indian, and part of the family had gone to Oklahoma to claim their land. So Henrietta was already there, and so the rest of the family in 1903, after these 2 lessons, left. So I circled Isaac and Emma, same family, right? They know this history, they live this history. Which part of the memo did they not get? Why is Isaac still in Alabama? Why is Emma still in Alabama? Didn't you get the memo? The rest of us read it. That's why we're in Oklahoma. Well, it turns out that Emma was a certified teacher. She was certified. She had been educated in Alabama, was a teacher. She had passed the Alabama state certification. Turns out that if you were black and you were a teacher and you were college educated, you lived in the South. And in fact, almost all of black college educated teachers lived in the South. She couldn't be anywhere else. This was where she could be a teacher if she stayed in Alabama. So the rest of y'all go to Oklahoma, but this is where I can be a teacher if I stay in Alabama. And Now, of course, black people are concentrated in the South, but the reality here is there's another thing, which is the white South has worked itself into a box. We're going to have segregated everything, including segregated schools. Who's going to teach in the segregated schools? Well, if we have white people teaching in segregated schools, then we have to pay a lot of money. We don't want to pay a lot of money. So let's have black functionaries teach in the black schools. Then we don't have to pay a lot of money because we're not going to pay the black people. We pay the white people. So black teachers live in the South. You see this very weird distribution, even though black people are leaving the South. And you would think, well, but why don't the best educated leave? Why don't the people whose houses got burned down, who saw their friends get shot trying to vote, why don't they leave? They should have the greatest mobility. They have the most skill. This is the way we think as economists. Something else is going on, something that we're not modeling, something that actually is right in front of our eyes if we thought about our models all the way through. This isn't how it's supposed to play out. So something is wrong in how you're modeling it and thinking through what are the possibilities. By 1950, I'm showing you 1940, 1950, because in 1940 we finally get to see people's salaries. We don't have that in earlier censuses. And you see that by the 1950s, some blacks had started to leave, and finally you see some black teachers appearing in the Pacific Division, which means California. 1940, there are no black teachers in the West, none, even though black people had already started going to California. When you look at the pay differences, 1940 is after the pay equalization lawsuits. This was the beginning of dismantling segregation, was to fight about equal pay for teachers. The blacks in the South with college degrees with the red bar, you see, don't get paid what whites do by 1940, even though they had started to win law cases. Just because you win a couple of law cases doesn't mean that every school system just falls down and says, oh, you're right, we have to obey. They had to be sued almost one by one to make them comply. And they're paid only a little bit more than whites who would have been at teacher colleges. It was not uncommon at this time period for someone to have a 2-year college degree and be qualified as a teacher at the state teacher colleges. And you will notice again this thing that if blacks could get hired outside of the South, they got paid a lot more than blacks who taught in the South. But there's that condition, if. And we all know if is the biggest 2-letter word in the English dictionary. By the 1950s, the effect of these equal pay suits takes hold. Blacks in the South get paid a lot more with bachelor's degrees, and there's a little bit more commonality between black and white teachers' pay. But you notice that blacks not in the South who are teachers actually get paid the most. And therein, this is how we modeled this race thing wrong. But what else would a black person with a college degree do? We're not thinking about who's maximizing what are they maximizing on? And if you look at the problem set of, I'm facing barriers, I have to maximize on a set of barriers. There are things I cannot do. Economists, normally we do these things like, everybody's free to do whatever they want to do, but suppose you aren't free to do whatever you want to do. Suppose there are barriers. Suppose you can't really say, oh, teachers get paid more in the North. I'm moving to the North. What if you're not free to do that? What if you are a teacher? Teachers aren't the highest paid college graduates. Well, maybe aren't free to be something other than a teacher. So now we're going to get to looking at railroads and Isaac, because this one I can now take apart how we typically do things. There's a whole literature on the problems with the railroads. And I encourage you to read it. And again, you have the slides, so please don't worry if you can't jot this down fast enough. But there's a whole literature on the issue of race and railroads. This is how we would typically model things. This is our first chance to look at wages and railroading. You see that on average, white men get paid almost twice as much as black men in railroading. There is far more equality among locomotive firemen, though. You will notice that, yes, blacks get paid less than whites if they are locomotive firemen. So let me take one little moment to explain a fireman to those of you who aren't into steam railroads. So the fireman is the person who keeps the fire. They don't put out the fire. They're the one in a steam engine that makes the engine have steam. They have to shovel the coal to make sure that there's steam and maintain steam pressure. This is a very dangerous job in the beginning of the industry because the boilers weren't that good and they often weren't regulated well enough and they could blow up. So this is something where you have to be very skilled because you could blow up the train, kill yourself and the engineer. And so it takes skill, it's dirty, it's grimy, and it's very physical because you're shoveling coal to make a 16-ton machine drag stuff. And in the hierarchy of the train and at the beginning of this industry, well, whites and only whites could be engineers. So the fireman is like the engineer's assistant. I do the clean job, I run the train. Somebody better shovel the coal. So this seems like a black man's job. And so in fact, that's kind of how it got viewed in many ways. Well, I'm subservient to the engineer and I do this. And the black men in the South had great prominence. Isaac, it turns out, was a fireman on a locomotive. And again, as you can see in 1940, not paid the same as whites, but closer in pay. How do we normally do this as economists? Oh, it's educational differences. Education differentiates who gets which occupation. You can see that this is an industry dominated by men who don't have a whole lot of education. This is not true for this industry. People need to think about this is a developing industry. It's new, it's growing quickly, and you're not going to learn this in a school because they're developing new engines, they're changing systems, they're improving all the time. You're not going to get this in a school. You're going to get this working. Black men don't have that much education, but neither did the whites. But you will see there's red everywhere. There are blacks with college education in the railroad industry. This is not an industry only of low-educated black men. Some of them had college degrees. So that's education. And of course, we economists knee-jerk, well, blacks have less education, so they can't be firemen. And so that'll explain it. And so we do this. This is the result of a typical regression in which we say, okay, how much do you get paid, the log of your wage? And then we put in a dummy variable for race, and we have education, and we have age. You will notice there's not very much return to education. That's a little teeny tiny bar. So the more education, yes, they got paid more, but not a lot more. You actually get more for experience than you do for education, and black men get paid 47% or roughly 47% less. Remember, we had like 50%. So part of this is maybe education. Unfortunately, you see, for economists, it doesn't stop there because we continue to have this tendency that, well, there must be a reason they get paid less money. We're going to abstract from all the stuff that we know about race that we've just learned. So what are those reasons? Well, we know schools were segregated. We know these men don't have the same occupation. So we should control for whether we're looking at segregated schools. We should control for occupation. So we have engineers who get paid the most, the firemen, the brakemen, education, age. We still are left with control for everything, and black men get paid 50% less. Actually, the coefficient of race got worse, meaning that within these things, blacks are being paid less. Now, unfortunately, again, the tendency for economists, because we have in our minds like factors of production cannot be paid differently, that would not be rational. We have this tendency to then want to keep looking at what makes the black workers inferior. This isn't taken to be Okay, well, if you did all of this machinations to create race and to create hierarchy, why doesn't that tell you that's the hierarchy? That's what the hierarchy is. That's why we did it. That's why we say you can't marry. That's why you say you cannot look out windows. We did all of that to engineer that outcome. The point was to put you in the position of making less money. We didn't do all that just to do it. It had a point. But no, that's not what we do. We will continue to argue about what's missing. There's something else we don't know about these black firemen. And, then it gets real ugly. Why don't we just look at the record? This race thing has a hierarchy. It has a meaning. The white workers in Georgia, led by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen, go on strike against the railroad in Augusta, Georgia. Why? Well, the head of the Augusta Railroad, Mr. Scott, is saying that the white union members are trying to kick blacks out of the railroad industry. The railroad workers say no. Mr. Scott says that this is part of a plan to drive the Negro from the railroads. The truth is our movement is only defensive because Mr. Scott's action is forcing Negro supremacy on the Georgia Railroad. They already have in Augusta Negroes who occupy the position of yard foreman of engines. And the white engineer is subject to his orders and control. Mr. Scott, you are violating this code. There's a hierarchy here. Black men do not order white men around. White men do not answer to black men. You, Mr. Scott, are saying we're trying to get them out. We don't want them out. We want them subservient to us. That's what that strike is about. Now, this industry is transforming because many of you know you've never seen a steam railroad for good reason. Because around this time, a little after 1909, late 19-teens, early 1920s, the diesel, which is powering cars, is converted to power trains. And if I have a diesel engine, there's no fire. I don't need a fireman. The fireman now is truly apprenticed to the engineer. The fireman is going to come home just as clean as the engineer. So this can no longer be a black man's job. As the railroads expand and become more important at the beginning of the 20th century, they're called on to carry the heavy load of a bigger, stronger, growing industry. They carry automobiles, they carry steel, they carry lumber. They are moving industry along. And the initial response is to build bigger and bigger and stronger steam engines, which means that the role of the fireman keeps getting more complicated and more needed until we get to 1925, because in 1925, the diesel engine starts to phase in. You can't just get rid of all the old stock. The diesel engine starts to phase in. So as the diesel engine phases in, we need to get rid of firemen. But notice that we're getting rid of the share of blacks who are firemen. The educational attainment of these firemen, again, they're mostly less educated. But you see there are no blacks who, remember I showed you that there were blacks with high school, college, they're not firemen. So again, knee-jerk from Economists, let's run a regression. Now, here's the oddity when you do this. Remember I said firemen are like an apprentice to the engineer. So what actually happens is, that is what happens. People who are firemen get promoted to engineers, except you can't promote blacks because they can't be engineers. So over time, the firemen who have the most standing as a fireman with the most experience are black. because the white ones who are good workers got promoted. And so when you look at this wage equation, then it's kind of fuzzy because you're missing that part we control for experience. And we see that the gap actually got smaller because we picked up some of that fuzziness. But again, this phasing out of firemen that takes place, and blacks are only in the South. Another thing for people to think about when you're modeling, why are blacks only in the South? Why is it that because blacks are so big in number that the railroads can't get rid of them, but in places where there are no blacks, they don't ever have to hire them? So how does that happen? So again, we're getting rid of firemen. They're going to be apprentices. The whites resort to violence. The whites actually kill black firemen. They tell the railroads, stop it. They even put a bounty. You get paid a bounty for killing black firemen. And they set an ambush for one of the black firemen. This is the Chicago Defender reporting in the 1920s on that. Now, to close the story out on Isaac, turns out, fortunately for Isaac, on his side is the federal government. Because during World War I, the United States has to have these railroads. We have to be moving things about. And so we end up needing them, and we need peace in the railroads. And so the federal government steps in on behalf of these black firemen, and Isaac does in the end move. He moves to Pennsylvania to where he actually gets to have a better job and get away from being lynched. Yeah, so I'm going to have to stop. You're going to have to miss the rest of the slides. But I do want to drive home just these couple of points. By 1940, you see they have stopped hiring black firemen. This is the age distribution of firemen in the railroad industry. You will notice that while you see a little bit of the red line for blacks, that far bar, 18 to 32, they're all white. In 1940, there are no black firemen below the age of 33. They have stopped hiring black men as firemen. They're about to be disappeared, as it were. They did fight back. I want to close with this because I don't want you to think that they took it lying down. They brought several suits because the firemen wanted to continue to figure out how can we discriminate, but they had worked themselves into a bind because union rules are very hard on seniority. And because the black workers had the seniority, they had to be given privilege over white workers. They tried to avoid that. And this suit I bring up because it was brought by Charles Hamilton Houston, who you are familiar with because of Brown versus Board of Education. He was the lawyer who laid the foundation and taught Thurgood Marshall, and it came to fruition on Brown v. Board of Education. But Houston fought against discrimination in many fields, including this one. So I have to stop there. I just want to give you one little closing comment. So why do we need diversity in the field? How do I know so much about Hilliard James? Why do I know what happened to Isaac and Emma and what happened to the family? Because Hilliard James was my second great-grandfather. The woman in the far right-hand corner that I described to you who had her house burned down, her name was Matilda James Spriggs. She is my great-grandmother. The house that they burned down was my great-grandfather's house. If you don't have diversity, then you often don't have people who have another set of knowledge base, who know that there were skilled people who faced real constraints, that it wasn't just, oh, they all left because of lynching, and they all went to the promised land. And they know that even if people had the skills, they were limited in what they could do with those skills. So there's a different view of the agency of people who confront barriers. And so you'd look at the problem differently. You'd look at it from the agent's perspective. What do you do? Here are all these barriers. How do I maximize subject to those constraints? And it's very hard to imagine the experiment that economists normally run, because we're running like you flip a coin. But you can't flip the coin because the experiment isn't really a level playing field. It truly is an unlevel playing field. And so you can't treat that. Normally these variables are supposed to represent, I did an experiment, but that wouldn't be the actual experiment, because that wouldn't be the true counterfactual. The missing isn't what is making these workers inferior. The missing variables, what were their real opportunities? What were they really maximizing on? That's the missing variable. Okay, I got to stop. John has to monitor questions.
Yeah, we're just a little bit over time, but we'll have room for like 1 or 2 questions if anyone has any. Well, I do have one question if no one has any questions, so I'm just going to ask. So, for the purposes of classroom instruction and like teaching in the classroom, are there like any specific comments you would have instructors sort of like attach when they include like a race and a regression to sort of elucidate things we talked about?
I just went through trying to answer that. Well, every variable, his question was, when professors do present papers, and there are lots of papers that they would like to present, in which race is a dummy variable, what would be my advice to them on how to characterize it? First, there is value in descriptive work in economics. Some of the most exciting work right now that Raj Chetty is doing is just descriptive. It's just telling us what's the dimension of the problem. And a regression is many things, but one of the things that it is a decomposition of the means. And so it lets you take apart how much are these things different because of something. And so it's instructive to understand that even if blacks had the same education as whites, even if blacks had the same occupation as whites in the railroads, even with all that, when I decompose it, I still get that these black men in the regression were being paid less money. That's, as a descriptive thing, is important because it's important for you to try and understand, well, what is that, what's the tangible thing here? If I then try and use that model, I have problems though. If I'm trying to use the model with any causative meaning to it, if I try and use it as a model as economists normally think of it, I run into all these problems because, as I indicated to you, race is endogenous. I've decided that there's a certain size group that if you put them in the bottom, then there's more for us at the top who can collude if you can keep them at the bottom. So if you run that regression, then that doesn't make any sense from an econometric perspective. You violated practically every rule we know of. So if you do it and then you want to try and talk causality, you have a lot of work to do because you're going to have to, as we would with any set of endogenous variables, you have to make it non-endogenous so that I can figure out what's the causal relationship here. And so you're on real thin ice if you try and do that. The worst among economics, and this is the big turnoff for black students, is because economists in their journal articles have this tendency, this need to not accept that negative coefficient as the end-all be-all and say, well, this was designed as an experiment in discrimination. It shows that there was discrimination. That's the size of it. That's not what economists tend to do. Instead, economists tend to do is there is some factor about these black workers we didn't observe because this data set only, and the census only gives me where they went to school, how much money they made. I don't know enough about them, but there's something else about them that must make them inferior so that they're getting paid less money. We don't know what that was. Maybe we're not quite modeling the difference in the quality of the schools by simply saying they went to segregated schools. That's not enough. Maybe we need, real measures of schooling. Maybe we need the test scores from the school. Maybe, but this endless whining and trying to say that there's something still inferior about them, to most students of color, that's just a turn off. Because many of us know that in our hearts, or we believe, discrimination is a real thing. So if you're trying to tell me that there's something else inferior about these workers, this is not a field for me, because, and some studies that you may read may throw the kitchen sink at this unobservable, and you still get a negative coefficient, and economists somehow or another are convinced, but there must be another unobserved variable. Understand why that's irritating, because you're saying that on net, what I observe is negative, on net what I don't observe, that is correlated with race is negative on net. Why? As economists, those of us who are labor economists know, if you control for everything, parents' education, parents' income, all sorts of characteristics about your school, that black students are more likely to apply to college, more likely to go to college than any other race in America. This is why student debt falls disproportionately on black students, because students who otherwise wouldn't be in college, they aren't. Poor black students are in college in a much higher share than is true for other groups. Ergo, you get more student debt. That's a pretty positive. So what's the negative that's correlated with race that outweighs you want education, that you are somebody who I should believe really wants to improve themselves, and if given the opportunity, if the playing field were level, you'd be the most educated. What's that negative? We economists also know blacks are less likely to use drugs. So it's not that you use drugs, because you're less likely to do that. I mean, you keep wondering, what is it that you think that you're going to uncover that outweighs any of the positives? What is it going to be? And so, of course, if you're sitting there in class and going, so on net, you're saying you think I'm inferior. I want to be a sociology major.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Sandra, I think this. Yeah, just.
So what we have learned about this entire thing is that diversity everywhere is really important, because it helps us in removing barriers and constraints. Then if it is so, then why does some organizations or institutions still inherently promote exclusivity or elitism?
Oh no, we did not learn that diversity is inherently anything about good for the organization. What you just learned is that we establish institutions deliberately to prevent diversity. And so once you understand that we established institutions to deliberately make sure there was no diversity, then as economists you should begin to wonder, why did we do that? Were these people irrational? Were they out their gourds? And then we should study, well, did the creation of these groups maximize anything? It appears that it maximized white income, because whites got paid a lot more than blacks. From a firm's perspective, you create monopsony. There are many levels on which monopsonies can be created. But if I'm the only firm that will hire blacks, I have a monopsony. So there are reasons why it can pay for firms to want these kind of divisions, because they can create monopsony power. And firms can profit from that monopsony power. So no, please, And I implore you, please don't buy into that sort of argument that people misinterpret. It's a misinterpretation of Becker to say that he says that in the long run, competition wipes it out. He posits that that's definitely a possibility, but this misinterpretation that economists have that diversity wins out is just not correct. And many people think, well, Becker had it right because he's writing in 1955, 1957, and they have in their minds, oh, look, Jackie Robinson. The Dodgers hired Jackie Robinson. The Dodgers win the World Series. Cleveland gets Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. The last time Cleveland won the World Series, because they had Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. And then we have this fairy tale that all of the teams instantly said, yes, we're wrong. We shouldn't be segregated. We should have black ball players. We shouldn't keep out good players like Jackie Robinson. In 1957, the Boston Red Sox still had not hired a black ball player. The Washington Senators never hired a black ball player. In fact, they moved to Minnesota to prevent them from having to hire a black ball player. This idea that everybody saw this and competition drove them to the result that because every team that won the World Series from like 1958 on had a black ball player, that is not what Major League Baseball did. They did not all rush to say the barriers need to come down. We just want to win baseball games. That's not what happened. So please don't say that's what you just learned.